Welcome to the podcast, Restore Yourself, Restore Your Marriage, where it's all about discovering the thoughts that get you in the mood, the thoughts that get you out of the mood, and how creating a deeper connection with yourself creates a deeper connection with your spouse. I'm your coach, Shelly Anderson, coaching you through life, love, and intimacy.
This is episode number 105. Are women designed for more pleasure than men? Ooh, sexy topic.
This is a competition?
No.
Okay, good. Because I don't want to compete with that.
No, because in reality, women would win.
They would, actually. And that's interesting because I think that would surprise a lot of people.
Yes, it would. So this is something that I think is going to be a very interesting episode because we are going to just talk about some of the different parts of women and just some of the math, right? Just some of the facts that really kind of show that women are created to experience pleasure. Like we're not just meant to have babies and procreate.
Yeah, and I think there's some pretty startling obvious evidence.
Yeah.
And some of the things we're going to share today, I think are going to really surprise a lot of people. And we're going to actually have some visuals in this episode. So those of you that are listening to this on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts, you may want to tune in to the YouTube version of this podcast at Anderson Coaching. That's our channel on YouTube, because we're going to be showing some things, some anatomy that I think will be shocking to some, and maybe many people listening to this may already know these things, but it's a good reminder as to the physiology and the biology and the way that our sex organs are made up, and the nerve endings and some other things that make up that pleasure. Now, I don't want to take over right now, but I just want to say this. I just find it fascinating that most people don't know these things.
Right. Yes.
And so we're going to talk about something that I think is a mystery. And unfortunately, I think it's probably because we focus so much on such a small sliver of what we call the intimacy trek. And it is very male pleasure focused in our world. And that is a tragedy.
Yes. It is a tragedy because it does create this challenge for the female experience. And then we wonder, like, we can feel the disconnect, and then we wonder why it's there, and then we think something's wrong with me because I don't experience this the way that I feel like I should be. And it's exactly for the reasons that you're saying. You know what I think is fascinating? This is just reminding me as you're saying this, that when we went to a bridal and marriage expo a couple months ago, we had what we call the Intimacy IQ. And it was on a little card, and we kind of passed it out to everyone that was walking around and interested to see what we were talking about. And it was fascinating to see that as people saw, oh, there's some questions on here. I bet I know all the answers.
Oh, yeah. Especially new people who are about to get married think they know everything.
They were actually really shocked when we would discuss the answers, and their answers were incorrect. They were shocked. They were actually taken back, like, oh my gosh, I thought I knew these answers. It was another way that we were able to see that this information is lacking.
It's lacking, and I'll say, as the male representative, I really do believe that it's lacking because we as men don't understand the process that a woman in general, I'm not speaking to every woman, but in general, that women need to go through to be able to experience much more intense pleasure than men do.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're not taught this.
No.
Because when we ask some of those questions on that intimacy IQ, if we were taught these things in basic anatomy classes in high school, or I don't even remember learning this in college, we would know these things. It would become so logical to us. So it just shows we're not being taught these things.
Can I just say, this stuff is so important and this is so groundbreaking, and it shouldn't be.
Right.
Please share this with whoever you can. We are trying to educate people so that they can find more joy in their life and joy in their marriage. So if you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe, like this episode. It helps get this out to more people. And please share this. This is going to blow your mind. And again, if you're listening to this and not watching it, you may want to tune in to YouTube so that you can watch some of the demonstration that we're going to share with you.
Yes. Okay, so let's dive in. So the first thing we wanted to actually just talk about as far as evidence and the numbers go is female anatomy. And when we're taught this, it's usually only from a reproductive point of view, especially in the school system, and just basic anatomy parts, all on the outside. That's really what we're taught. We're taught how to just label the body parts. And so what happens is we end up missing the most important body part for the women when it comes to pleasure. It's just usually not even discussed or labeled on the anatomy pictures in the textbooks.
And the part that we're talking about is the clitoris. And for those that are familiar with the clitoris, you've probably only seen literally the tip of the iceberg.
Yes. So we're going to show you an actual 3D printed model of the vagina, the vulva, that whole area, and also show you what is actually seen of the clitoris. But then we're going to show you the behind the scenes of how the clitoris actually looks in the body, because it's so much larger than what you see from the outside, just from the, kind of like a snapshot view of it. And I think this is what is really going to astonish people is we don't know this. Women don't know this about themselves.
Yeah.
So if you're viewing it, then you can see right here. So if you're viewing it, this is the front of the vagina, and this pink spot right here, that's the clitoris. And even this is not obvious because in real life, we have skin that's covering this. And so it takes a dedicated husband and wife to be able to understand that you have to be able to pull back that skin,
which is called the clitoral hood.
The clitoral hood, almost like an unveiling. I love to think about, a bride with her veil on, and it has to be lifted and pulled back to be able to see her face. And I like to be able to think of this clitoral hood also being pulled back to reveal this mystery. And so once that is pulled back, then you can see the clitoris, and it's not big compared to the rest of the vagina. So again, for those who are watching, if you take a look at the backside,
and this is what's inside or behind the vulva.
Yes, the clitoris is quite large and it has multiple parts. And so when we start to learn that, we can see that it's not just this one little dot of pleasure. It's expansive.
It's not just a button.
It's not just a button. It is expansive, and it reaches down. And if you look at the anatomy, and this is, again, what we're not taught, is the clitoris actually wraps around the vaginal opening. And so when we talk about pleasure, let's talk about the number of nerve endings. And I think we have talked about this number before on some previous podcasts, but the penis has 4,000 nerve endings in it. And the penis has multiple functions. The clitoris, in contrast, has 8,000 nerve endings in it, and it only has one purpose. We don't pee through the clitoris. There's no urine passing through it. There's no other function except pleasure.
Isn't this interesting? Because there's two competing things here that I think we're taught that it mess us up, right?
Yeah.
If you just believe in evolution, okay, and all you believe in is evolution, why would this have been evolved, right? This pleasure center, which is gigantic compared to what we think. And it has these vestibules coming down, and it's very large, and it is kind of all-encompassing when you look at the vagina as a whole, right? So if you believe that evolution is the only reason we're here, okay, then you have to ask yourself, well, why was this evolved?
Yeah.
This pleasure? Because what we're really taught is that, well, men have all this, they have this sex drive so that, they can populate the earth, and so that procreation can happen, and so that babies will be born. Okay, and we forget that, women actually do have a pleasure center, and they do have that drive too. They just get to it differently than men do.
Yeah.
Okay, the competing side is, all right, so I think that most people that are watching this believe that we are created by God, a divine being. So then the next question is, if you're created by God, why did he create this incredible organ that is meant only to give women pleasure?
Right.
And I would say, because I believe that we were created by God, I would say that he created this so that women could experience intense pleasure, but it's also a test for us as men, because he didn't just make it obvious, and he didn't just make it as simple as the sexual pleasure for men. And so he really has given us a challenge to figure out together in marriage how this is supposed to really work and how to get to that place. And we're going to talk about the intimacy trek in a little bit, but the intimacy trek is huge. And those of us that don't know this may just say, you know what? It just is how it is. Men just are more focused on the pleasure side, and I just have to either do my duty and have sex or whatever. And women aren't experiencing what they're supposed to experience because us men, we either don't have the education or don't have the patience or don't have the compassion and the curiosity to discover this with our wives.
Yeah. Well, I think you bring up some good points. Number one, I think the lacking of education, I think that is one of the biggest. But also with this, once you learn it, there has to be an acceptance that this is actually part of the process, right? That women have to, number one, know that, the clitoris has 8,000 nerve endings and that it's an entire organ and it's not just this little, thing only and needs to be ignored. But there's also this acceptance that there is a process, and if we are committed to having a good sexual relationship, we can't ignore it. We can't wish that it was a different way. We can't wish that the intimacy trek didn't exist just so it would be easier or more convenient. There has to be that acceptance that's like, my wife's process is different than mine, and there's nothing wrong with her because it's different.
It's right. It's supposed to be that way.
That's right.
It really is supposed to be that way. Again, back to the clitoris, okay? And I don't want to be the weird perverted guy on this podcast, right? Talking about the clitoris all the time. For me, this is so fascinating because this is not something that I have known.
Right.
Right? My whole life.
Right.
This is not something that men know. Okay? When men discover the intimacy trek, now if they're single and they're just, focused on their own pleasure, they probably won't care that much.
Yeah.
Maybe they do, but it's not going to be for the right reasons. And there's all kinds of negative outcomes associated with that. We talk about marriage because we think marriage is the best.
Right.
We love marriage,
Yes.
as hard as it is, as terrible as it can be at times, because it's so emotionally draining and difficult and disappointing at times. But when we discover this as a man, as I've learned about the intimacy trek, where I understand how important the emotional desire side is for you, and that whole process of getting to the physical, it doesn't just happen like that, like it does for men.
Right.
As I've discovered that, and then as I've discovered that, I've learned over this last couple years, probably not, maybe less than that, that this organ, this clitoris, is the size it is, and the way that it actually works isn't just from physical stimulation. It is so involved, and that is why it's like you got to work hard for great results, right?
Yes.
Incredible results and incredible miracles don't just happen because you snap your fingers.
That's right.
For me, it has been such a wonderful discovery because I'm not thinking just about myself.
Yeah.
I'm thinking more about you. And even if we don't get to an orgasm, right? Because that's not the end goal.
Right.
It really isn't. There's so much more to intimacy. And I think one of the problems is when people hear intimacy, they just think about sex.
Yes.
They just think about orgasm or the physical part, or not orgasm and just the physical part.
Yeah.
Intimacy is not just about sex. And the clitoris, I think, is such a great representation of why it is so much more involved, because to actually access the full pleasure of this for women, it takes so much more, and it is so much more about connection, and it's so much more about it's teamwork.
Yeah, it really is. And so if we're just looking again at just some of the numbers, right? We've talked about the penis having 4,000 nerve endings, the clitoris having 8,000. I think it's also important, because women aren't taught this when we're taught anatomy, is that the vagina, the vaginal opening, has very few nerve endings. And so when we are growing up and we see movies and or learn that about sex, and we think that the orgasm is coming mainly from intercourse and the penis going inside the vagina, we're not experiencing as much pleasure there because there's not as many nerve endings there that are meant for pleasure. And there's a reason for this. It's because we birth babies from the vaginal canal. And so if we had the most nerve endings there, we would never, ever have more than one baby, right? We would think, oh, yes, we want to have a baby. We would have one, and it would be so excruciating that we would never do it again.
It's excruciating enough.
It's excruciating enough with the few that we have there. And so if we can really start to embrace this concept that intercourse is one part of the experience, but that is not where we are going to experience the most pleasure, that can really help us make this distinction of, yes, we need to go to the clitoris for pleasure. If we think and get stuck believing that it's only going to come from intercourse, we may be really confused as to why we're not enjoying the whole experience more if the clitoris is being ignored.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to start doing some videos just for men at some point in the future, and I will be doing some clean and classy sex ed for men. I think men are very intelligent. Like I'm not doing this. I don't want to do this just because I think that men are stupid and they don't know. I just think that we've been misinformed, and I think it's by design. Honestly, I think that there is. There's a power or force out there that really is tries to discourage happiness in marriage in this world, and I think part of that is this hiding or this covering up of the truth about women.
Mm-hmm.
Because look, we do not promote pornography at all, and we do not encourage anybody to look at pornography. We encourage you not to look at pornography. But even in movies, any kind of media, what we see in media and in pornography and the things that are out there about sex, it's so focused on just the sex act, and it does not show any of the intimacy track other than that. And also it is very male driven.
Yes, this is true.
I mean, you wonder why, maybe we cut this out of this podcast, but you wonder why so many women are just like done with men. And they're just like, you know what? I want another woman to be my partner because they understand me more than a man does.
Right.
How tragic is that?
Yeah. It is. And I think also, you and I were listening to a news thing earlier this morning where they were saying that in today's world, for the first time, we are having a generation, the younger generation, that is not being taught, hey, you should get married. It is in the betterment of your personal growth and development. It's better for society. It's better for our communities. It's better for our children. It's better for the whole world to be married. And the world is starting to turn their back against that. And so we're saying, no, just be single, be free, do whatever you want and whatever makes you happy without obligations. And they're saying that for the first time ever, like we are really entering into that phase where we're not promoting marriage and kind of turning our back on it. And I think it might be easier to do that in today's world because we aren't taught these things in detail, right? They're just left out and neglected. Now, the other thing I want to say about the clitoris is that as the different parts and the expansions of the clitoris go down through the body and wrap around, they continue to connect to other nerves in the body. So it ends up creating this network of nerves. And I think this is why women can really experience full body orgasms, very expansive orgasms. The more details and more thoughts and more of our emotions are included in the experience, the greater these networks and these nerves can send their signals to one another, and our level of pleasure will go up.
Well, it's designed to connect to other nerves.
Yes.
So you hear about women when they have orgasms, having full body orgasms.
Yeah.
You don't hear that from men as much.
No.
Right? It's very focused
Yes.
on the penis.
Yes.
And, of course your whole body, will feel, euphoria and pleasure just because, you feel good.
Yeah.
But this organ is designed to connect to tens of thousands of other nerve endings.
Yes, a lot. It's not just like one or two.
Now look,
Thousands.
if you're in a camp where you don't have orgasms very easily, or you've never had an orgasm, there's nothing to be ashamed of with that. But what we're trying to do is help you and even help your husband understand that exploring this part of you and husbands being less self-absorbed about the sex part.
Yeah.
Now, I would just say any men that are listening to this, or any women that are in that camp, do whatever you can to encourage your husband to take the time with you, to communicate with you, and to talk about what actually does feel good.
Yeah.
And even if it's just a little bit at a time, to focus on that, you will learn and grow into this. And it is possible. You are designed to be able to have that pleasure.
Yeah, it's so true. You've mentioned the intimacy trek a few times now, and I think we really need to make sure we talk about the different parts of the intimacy trek so that we can understand how these things all work together. And so the first part of the intimacy trek has to do with our thoughts, right? Because we're going to look at this as a journey. And one of the root words for intimacy is trekker, which is like I think it's Norwegian. I can't remember the exact location of this root word, but it has to do with having a pull, being drawn towards wanting to be close to your spouse. And again, I think this is such a big difference between men feeling a sex drive, like something behind them pushing them towards being intimate and populating the earth. Whereas for women, we need to feel like, oh, what draws us into my husband, not what's pushing us from behind, but it's our thoughts. Our thoughts really are at the heart of all of it. And this is why the brain is called the first sex organ. And we cover all this in detail in the course, The Intimacy Effect, that you can find on Shelly.Anderson Coaching. And This is so key. It is so key. So we are constantly reminding everyone that the brain is the first sex organ. That's because that's where all of our thoughts are. So if we have really negative thoughts about ourselves or about how the marriage is going or about our spouse's parenting skills or lack of it, or if we have negative thoughts about sex, or think it's just primal or animalistic, all of those things contribute to how we're going to experience pleasure.
Yeah.
So we really have to kind of use the as our basis what our thoughts are. So that's the first part of the intimacy track. The second part is that when whatever thoughts we're having, whether they're positive or negative, they are going to affect our emotions, our desire. And we talked about this at length in our last podcast about having desire. And every thought we have is either going to contribute to our desire to be closer to our spouse, or is going to restrict that desire. And again, it doesn't have to be that every thought is about these things, but even if we're thinking about dishes, our thought about the dishes will either contribute to our desire for intimacy or it's going to take away from it. So we really have to increase our thought awareness because it does affect our emotions. And so if we never really tune into that desire of wanting to be closer to our spouse and to actually be led and drawn into sharing our bodies physically with one another, then when we just go to have sex out of duty, it's going to feel very disconnected. We're not going to be able to tap into that pleasure part of our brain that enjoys it because our thoughts are all over the place. And then, of course, we're going to be like, well, why would I go back for more?
Yeah.
So those are the first two most significant components of the intimacy trek: our thoughts and then triggering our emotional desire. After emotional desire, if we are actually tuning into it, our body will start to experience naturally its state of being aroused, this physical arousal, which prepares the body for intercourse so that it is more pleasurable. Again, if we skip arousal and just are like, okay, it's time to have sex, it's 10 o'clock on Wednesday night, and we skip the first three, then our body has not prepared, and the experience of intercourse, it could be so much more uncomfortable. And again, we find ourselves saying, like, why would I go back for more? It's because we're skipping steps. So then the fourth step is actually experiencing intercourse and orgasm. And then the final step is this resolution, the afterglow, and all the beautiful things that can happen there. But also, we have to recognize if things haven't gone well in the intimacy trek or we've skipped steps, that afterglow is also usually a clear sign. If we're not feeling good or we cry after sex and not happy tears, that's an indication that we have skipped some steps. So the goal here in explaining the intimacy trek and all the different parts of it is so that we have an awareness of the order for the experience of the woman, so that we can increase pleasure and not look at it as some obscure thing that we just talk about, but it's actually obtainable if we go through this process, the way our bodies are actually created. So we actually need to go through this process and be able to put good thoughts back in, good thoughts about ourselves, good thoughts about how our body is created, good thoughts about the clitoris, good thoughts about human anatomy and our connection and the point of intimacy in the relationship. And once we can start to have those good thoughts, we're putting the foundational aspect back into our whole experience. This is what's going to heighten pleasure just by doing that in and of itself.
And I just, again, I'm shameless, but I'm going to plug another one of our courses. And we have a course called First Night, First Year. And it's on Shelly.Anderson.com or Shelly.AndersonCoaching.com, Shelly.AndersonCoaching.com. First night, first year. Now, this course was designed for people who are preparing to be married. And there's a lot of, like, all this information is in there. Now, I just want to encourage those of you that are already married to look at that. Just learn more about that course, get online, look at that course, because you may have been married for 10, 20 years, longer than that, right? You may feel like you're an expert in these things, and you probably are. But for your husband, if you want your husband to learn more about these things, that might be a course that you two take together.
Yeah.
And it's going to take some humility for you two to take a course that's designed for people who are preparing to be married. But I don't think there's any shame in it, because that course teaches things that, again, like this episode, most people just don't know.
Right.
And I actually think that course is more helpful to men even than women, because it teaches men about their wife.
Yeah.
And how she works and how she operates. So I highly encourage anyone, whether you're preparing to be married or you're already married, to take that course, first night, first year.
Well, you bring up an interesting point, because a lot of times I think, especially when a client comes to me, it's because she's really struggling with this part of her life, and her relationship. And she really does want her husband to change, quote unquote. Like, I wish he was just different. When a woman takes it upon herself to understand herself first for herself, and then can share this information with her husband, like you're talking about, there is a change that takes place.
There is.
It's just that it's not a forced change, and there's no controlling tactics there. There's no manipulation. It's just knowledge that has not been there before. So I love what you're saying, because things do change with knowledge.
I just want to say that I am ashamed as a man, and in the first half of our marriage, the things that I knew, and I thought I knew a lot. Like I was raised in a way that, we talked about sex. I've been open about sex my whole life.
Yeah.
I've never been ashamed to talk about it, obviously, but I'm ashamed at the things that I didn't know about you and the things that I assumed about you. And as I have learned more and more about the way that you work, I'm actually quite embarrassed about some of the ways I approached you when it came to intimacy. And if I feel that way, and I guarantee you I'm more open and probably more knowledgeable about this than most other guys. Now, I could be wrong about your husband or you, whoever you're listening to, but this is something I'm kind of known for, is being it's pretty easy for me to talk about these things.
Yeah.
And I have felt shame and embarrassment and sadness that I didn't know these things sooner. And if I feel that way, then I'm sure that there's others that would feel the same. And so why not learn what you can so that you can be a better husband to your wife?
Yeah, that's so true. Now, I think as we're getting, closer to the end of this episode, it's important to just note a few things. And that is that if the thoughts are at the base of our experience with intimacy, and if the brain is the first sex organ, then we have to also stop disconnecting intimacy and pleasure from who we are as a person, especially for women. I think we do a disservice to ourselves when we say, "Oh, that's only for men. The men, experience pleasure," or sex is just for my husband. We are really disconnecting from ourselves. And so what we need to do is really challenge our thinking in 4 categories. And that is to really try to reconnect with our own thoughts about our relationship with sex as a woman, as a wife, as an individual, right? We have to do that for ourselves. What is our relationship with pleasure? And we need to really dive deep for ourselves.
Do that for yourself and not for your husband.
Yes. Second, we need to say, what is the relationship? What are my thoughts that have to do with sex and pleasure in terms of spirituality? We really need to address that and challenge it, because a lot of times they're negative simply because we have not challenged it.
Again, if you believe you were created by God and you look at this clitoris, he must not have a problem with you having pleasure.
That's right. That's right.
That's all I'll say about that.
Third, we do need to question and challenge our relationship with just the concept of sex in and of itself. We really need to say, like, why am I thinking such negative thoughts? What are the negative thoughts that I have just about that part in and of itself, the actual act, the actual experience of pleasure? And then the last part is, what is my relationship with how I view sex and how it connects me to my spouse? Because a lot of times, if we haven't done this thought work in these other areas for ourselves, we are going to have a lot of negative thoughts towards our spouse when they want it and we don't.
Yeah.
We are going to horribilize our spouse. We're going to think they're animalistic, that they're perverts, that they're sex addicts, all these horrible things when you're just experiencing the natural desire to be intimate.
The way that we were created.
Yes.
And it's like there's a scripture called bridle, and it says bridle all your passions.
Yeah.
And it's a prophet talking to his son about the law of chastity and morality. And that is an interesting scripture, because bridle all your passions doesn't mean suppress and ignore them.
No.
Your passions are there. They're a creation. We just have to learn how to use them in appropriate ways.
And they're most effective when we learn how to use them in effective ways.
They're beyond what you see in movies and TV and all these things, and like, oh, this explosive, passionate sex. Well, you know what? The explosive, passionate sex is just one little slice of the whole.
Yeah.
And the joy, and this is where pleasure is just one part of this, right?
Yeah.
The true goal is joy and trust and happiness in marriage, even though maybe half of the time you're not happy. But guess what? There's supposed to be opposition in all things. And that's one of the beautiful things about marriage, because that's how we grow, is by having some resistance and challenges that we need to grow through.
That's right. And so the final point I think that we wanted to make here is that, yes, you will discover more about yourself in the context of marriage and intimacy. And when you face those hard times, that's the opportunity to go, this is exactly right. Learning about this side of myself is meant for the marriage relationship. It's meant to be discovered and explored and challenged in this relationship at this time in our lives as mature adults who are committed to work through those things. It's exactly right if we're struggling through it. It's exactly right. Now, the final note we'll make is that there is a pleasure part of the brain, and it responds to pleasure. It understands pleasure. And so if we understand that our brain is trying to compute and acknowledge and process the concept of pleasure, again, our thoughts about all this are going to matter significantly. Because if we never experience pleasure, our brain is not going to want to go back for more.
Yeah.
And if we don't think about intimacy or any aspect of it with a concept of, like, there could be enjoyment there. There could be pleasure. I just haven't discovered it yet. If we never do that, again, our brain is not going to want to go back for more. And if we don't have an eagerness to discover these things that are mysterious to us right now, then our brain will actually not experience pleasure. So we really need to involve our brain and our thoughts in order for it to actually experience the pleasure when it shows up.
And I want to make one more point, and that is that pleasure has a purpose beyond the pleasure itself when we're talking about intimacy.
Yeah.
And that is connection. Like you're saying, that desire to come back for more. Well, we're created differently, men and women. And for men, yeah, we love sex and we want to be close to our wives that way. But as the women discover this mysterious part of themselves, not only will they want to be closer to their husbands, but also your husband will start to see things differently too.
Yes.
They'll start to see things more along the lines of that intimacy trek and understand that full experience rather than just the physical. And that really does bring happiness in the connection that it encourages.
Yes. So again, I think most of my clients want to avoid this part of themselves, but here's the beauty. It's exactly what you're saying. If we start to really discover this part of ourselves, for ourselves first, we end up creating an environment that influences our husband naturally instead of just trying to force and change that and wishing you were so less animalistic. It just happens naturally. And so being able to take that on for yourself, knowing it's going to have a beautiful effect on your spouse, can be so encouraging.
Yeah.
So we just encourage all of you to really take a closer look at some of the courses that we offer. Again, we go into a lot of these types of details in these courses, and also share it with anyone else that you know who might need this or who is engaged and getting ready to be married, ready for that first night. This will help them out so much. Because remember, the more you restore this type of intimacy with yourself, the more you restore it with your spouse. Thank you so much for listening today, and we hope you will join us again next week.